People ask me about our church often, about what denomination it is, what traditions it follows. Is it in this category of church or that category of church? And I have to say, it's really hard to say. Come and see. What I can say about us is that we do our best to love God and love Jesus and love each other. We try to make our worship beautiful and intelligent. We try to live out God's love by helping our neighbors here in New Haven. I can't promise that we're perfect because we're certainly not, and we will probably disappoint you at some point. But we will love you, and we will be honest with you. So try it out for a few weeks, but I'll let you know it has worked for innumerable students over the years. But enough introduction and on to the sermon. That's, I hope, what you came for. I want to begin with a strange moment I had this week in my office, and it may only be on Yale computers. But have you ever noticed in that long, long wait after you turn on your computer at the beginning of the day, and you're waiting for Microsoft Outlook to open, and waiting, and waiting, and waiting. It may just be the Yale frame, but it really takes forever. And you're fidgeting, and you're tapping your fingers, and the little message comes across the screen. And it says, setting up identity. I have no technical sense what Outlook thinks it is doing as it sets up my identity. But I thought it was an interesting metaphor for what we're doing as we begin college, setting up an identity. Because perhaps for the first time in your life, you're surrounded by people who don't already know you, don't already know your family, don't know your big brother or big sister, don't know your accomplishments and your mistakes. So you have the option to set up an identity here at Yale. I once heard a story about a young woman from Plains, Georgia, and only the older folks will know that town. She was named Sarah, and she went to a small liberal arts college in North Carolina. And when she arrived, her hallmates saw her hometown listed in the Facebook, and they immediately connected her with another famous native of Plains, Georgia, former President Jimmy Carter. So they asked her, do you know President Carter, who's still alive and still flying around the world? And she faced a difficult decision. She'd never really met Jimmy Carter, even though it's a small town. She'd seen him at big gatherings, but she'd never talked to him one-on-one. But she was a shy young woman and didn't have that many special qualities or accomplishments to talk about, and didn't want to disappoint her new friends on her hall, so she said, sure, I know him. I've talked to him a lot. He comes over to our house. And from there, over the weeks, the story grew. Soon she was telling people she took care of Carter's dog, that the former president had helped her with a school paper, and so on and so on. This was her claim to fame. And soon it sounded like she was almost related to him. But 3 months later, to her horror, she saw a poster that said that President Carter was coming to campus to speak about peace in the Middle East. And her hallmates saw the posters and started asking when they were going to meet him, her friend, President Carter. And could they come along to the lecture, and perhaps she could have him come up to their hall and talk to them and have cookies. And she thought, maybe today is the right day to drop out of college. Or maybe I can develop malaria before next week. Or simply just disappearing the day that the president came to campus. But the day came, and she had no good plan for getting out of it, except hoping that Carter would be too busy. But as she and her whole hall were trooping into the lecture hall, all of them expecting her to introduce them to the president, suddenly a door opens onto the hallway that they're walking down, and there is President Carter with the president of the college walking to the lecture hall. And one of her more excitable classmates runs up to Carter and says, "Hey, here's your old friend Sarah from Plains." And she points to Sarah. And Carter turns, of course, ever gracious, with a smile on his face, and Sarah tentatively steps forward. She said later she was ready to die, ready to melt, ready to vomit. Anything to get away, but Carter was walking up to her, and all her friends would learn that she was a big fat liar and her life in college would be over. Carter hesitated for half a moment, and Sarah could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out who she was. And then he opened his arms and gave her a big hug and said, "Sarah, how wonderful to see you again. How are you?" And her friend's eyes lit up, and Sarah proceeded to introduce all her hallmates to the former president. And after a brief conversation, the college president ushered President Carter to the lecture. But before he left, Carter leaned down and whispered in Sarah's ear and said, "You owe me one, Sarah." Coming to college is about working out who you really are. Some of the things you've hoped to change about yourself, you'll discover are really not changeable. They're part of who you are. Some of the things you thought you were certain about yourself, those are the things that might change. This is the time to discover which things about your family, your hometown, your culture have become a permanent part of you and which will be left behind, and some will be left behind. In the wonderful scriptures we hear today from the prophet Isaiah and St. Luke's gospel, the prophet and the Savior are also working on identity. They're taking a piece of what God's people think they are, and they're using it to reinterpret who they think God's people should be. And the issue in these two passages is the Sabbath, the commanded day of rest. Always a good issue here at Yale, where we really don't believe that we're ever supposed to rest, I'm sorry to say. Isaiah, writing after the exile in Jerusalem, says to the people, "You think you're observing the Sabbath, you think you're good, righteous people, but you're really not. Even as you go through the motions of the Sabbath, you're really all about your own business. The Sabbath God chooses is not about your rituals, it's about how you live. It's about not oppressing others or judging others. It's about not speaking evil of others. The Sabbath is not about coming to a place and saying the magic words. The Sabbath God chooses is when you take the food off of your own plate and give it to the hungry. It's when you not only pray for or advocate for those who are suffering, but you actually go and meet their needs." That's the words Isaiah uses. You actually meet their needs. That, God says, is a Sabbath. If you do that, God will be with you in the tough times. And in a wonderful phrase, Isaiah says, "You will be like a spring of water that never fails. God will make your bones strong." I love that. It's like vitamin-fortified cereal. The prophet takes something the people know and uses it to tell them something they don't know. So does Jesus. On his way, in the midst of his long journey to Jerusalem, he comes to this village on the Sabbath, and he seems to randomly choose this woman who's crippled. She's bent over, possibly by osteoporosis. When I was a missionary in India, I used to see women who were literally 90 degrees bent over at the waist and unable to stand. So he sees this woman, and he just reaches out to her, and he lays hands on her, and he heals her. But one of the religious leaders gets up in Jesus' face about healing on the Sabbath, and Jesus gives it right back. I love the New Testament. It's not at all religious. It's all about real-life fights. Jesus gives it right back to this guy, and he says, "You untie your donkey and lead it to water on the Sabbath, but I can't unbind this woman's suffering." What's wrong with you? What's wrong with your idea of the Sabbath? Jesus and Isaiah's God is a God of surprises. Just when you think you know what the right path is and what doing the right and holy thing is, God sends a prophet or a son to show you that God's vision is unimaginably bigger than your religion. Father John Shea, one of my favorite writers, says that every belief we have about God has a literal and a latent aspect. The literal is what we would say our belief is if somebody asked us what the words are. The latent is how it affects our attitudes and our behavior. The synagogue leader doesn't realize that his devotion to the literal Sabbath may be standing in the way of God's healing love. The people of Isaiah's Jerusalem can't see that their literal practice of the Sabbath disguises their systemic injustice. It's about both the things you believe and the way you live them out. Even our decisions about our religious identity are not without unintended consequences. Lifting up the God of victory may obscure the God of peace. Lifting up the God of personal salvation may undermine the gospel's requirement of community. Shea gives this long list. He says things like, a theology that emphasizes God as king may encourage mindless compliance to authority. A theology that emphasizes the suffering and death of Jesus may sap the joy of creation out of its adherents. The step you're taking to Yale is a step into the complexity of religious life. It's not Sunday school anymore. And we invite you into the daily struggle of this complexity, that belief has consequences of all kinds. And the belief actually changes as we learn that it has negative consequences sometimes in our lives. Jesus and Isaiah want their hearers to see that a good religious belief may still have latent bad effects. Father Shea has this wonderful line. He says, when people hold a theology, the theology also holds them. Therefore, we must be careful what we put in our minds. When others who don't share our Christian faith look at us, what they see is not the sincerity and beauty of our beliefs, I'm sorry to say. They see what we do to other people. They see our attitudes and our actions, and no amount of sincerity or beauty can overcome a judgmental or an angry spirit. What Jesus and Isaiah point us to is a certain level of suspicion about religion, even within religion, and this is where it gets really interesting. It's a very Jewish spirit, and perhaps a very Protestant one. We need to test not only the orthodoxy and coherence of belief, not only what it does for us, but we need to also ask what it does to us, what dishonesty or violence it might cloak. Too often, religious groups want to stifle all these questions. I remember when I was in college, I went to a couple of groups, and after just a few meetings, you quickly realized that some questions just weren't allowed. You weren't allowed to ask those questions here. No one ever says that, but the message is clear. This church hopes to be a place where all questions are encouraged. That doesn't mean I won't get flustered when you ask. I'm an introvert. It takes me a little while to process, but I promise I'll get back to you with my best answer. In our daily struggles to build our identities, Christians are called to have a discipline of suspicion about their own identity as well. Yale is a great place to try on a full wardrobe of identities. Academic juggernaut, activist on the barricades, capitalist, socialist, reactionary, radical, Nobel-bound scientist, hipster, artist, bad boy, bad girl, object of desire, object of envy, object of fear. As Christians, we're called to hold each outfit up to the light and ask, not only does this make me look good, but also does this make me the person God sees in me? Not only does this make me feel good, but does this give me inner peace? Not only is this cool, but is this right? Isaiah and Jesus call us to lead complex moral lives in a world that wants simplicity and one-line answers. Not lives where we seize hold of popular or comfortable or safe identities, but lives of inner struggle between the angels and demons of our own desires, between our assumptions and prejudices and the persistent, quiet voice of conscience, between personal accomplishment and success and justice and compassion for the suffering. Christ is in us and with us most and best when we can stand back from our identities and ask without pride or self-hatred, is this the life God has chosen for me? And when I have the courage to take that loving, searching, deep, and probing look at myself and turn around and resolve again and again and again to love God and love neighbor, not in theory or in doctrine or in generalities, but to love God here and now, in this day of my life, in the midst of my struggles, and to love not humanity in general, but those I hate, those I push away, those I'm afraid of. If I can do that, then indeed I will be like a tree planted by streams of water that never run dry. My light shall rise in the darkness. My bones will indeed be strong. We will be called repairers of the breach and restorers of nations, Isaiah says. Setting up our identities, whether we're 18 or 48 years old, is the spiritual task of our lifetimes. Choose wisely what you put in your head. I think it was Quaker scholar Parker Palmer who said, our life's path is less like an arrow in flight and more like a character in a video game, always bouncing off obstacles, taking new and unimagined paths, turning around and starting over again. I know I speak for all of us here at the University Church when I say we look forward to praying for you, supporting you, and encouraging you in this amazing adventure. Amen.